Hello, Avatar fans, and welcome to the next episode of the Avatar Online podcast. This is going to be episode 241 of our regular shows, and we're recording this on April 30th, 2022. This is the official podcast for the fan site Avatar The Last Airbender Online.com. I'm your main host, Morgan Airspeed Prime. Joining me on the podcast is Greg2B from the site.
What's up, everyone?
Excellent. So, we have a sort of relatively typical show, or I suppose what is going to be a typical show going forward, and that is that we have news to cover, and then we'll be doing our kind of re-review episodes for the episode. So, people seem to like when we re-reviewed Korra for the anniversary, and like we said, we'd leave it up to you guys to decide if you wanted to do that or not, and people seemed up for it. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be reviewing ATLA episode 1 and 2 later on, and that will leave us for the episodes following this to be able to do it sort of like side by side, where it's one Korra episode, one Avatar episode in each of the podcasts. So that's the way it's going to go. But we'll jump into the news first. So decent number of things, but only one or two of the items are actually like important. So relatively brief one, but Braving the Elements, the official Avatar podcast, has been confirmed for a season 2. The season 2 is starting next week, May 3rd. And they just put out a trailer just highlighting some of the guests they're going to have, which is again a lot of the people they interviewed in the first season, and I guess some other people as well. I suppose for us, mainly just the idea that they seem to be suggesting there's going to be another Mike and Brian interview, which I guess would be one of the rare times they speak about things these days, and there might be a chance for some news to come out depending on when that podcast gets released. I'm not expecting too much, just because, you know, I tend to not really listen to this podcast, and the episodes I have listened to, while fine, have not really made it like absolute must kind of listen to things for me. But Greg, what are your thoughts on season 2 of Braving the Elements?
Yes, it's nice to see that they're continuing with that, because I know a lot of people are really into it and they really enjoy sort of the style that they go for with things. But yeah, for me personally, it also isn't something that I look towards as much. I do check out the interviews and the other ones that they have along those lines, and if they do have Mike and Brian on, I guess that would be one to focus more so on, if there might be anything that I guess could be gleaned from that. But I wouldn't necessarily expect anything, news breaking to come from that podcast per se.
Yeah, that's just the way things are. But, it's continuing. There's never any doubt it was going to get a season 2, but it's confirmed. So that's that. We'll move into some merchandise news here, because we did get one of the bigger pieces of merchandise finally revealed. And that is that we got the full reveal of the Nendoroid Aang from Good Smile Company. So, unfortunately, we didn't get the Pop-Up Parade Korra revealed as well. So that was a little bit of a disappointment, but we do have like all the pictures for the Nendoroid Aang. It's up for pre-order. We know all the details, and it is very, very cool. Obviously, I think everyone knows what to expect from Nendoroids, but I think they did a really good job. It is Book 1 Aang, and he comes with, his staff, a stand, of course. He has a sort of, stern expression, a smiley expression. He comes with Momo. There's also an Avatar state kind of face swap as well. He comes with like an airball / air scooter, and obviously the sort of hand, arm, leg parts to get him into certain positions, as well as a Appa sort of like clear card stand thing in the background, because of course they're not going to give you a full Appa with this, but looks pretty nice. So pretty much everything you want from, Book 1 Aang, that's not just, picking out random items that he had in random episodes. This is most of the main stuff I think you would want. So the price on the website says 6,600 yen, and basically that's like what, $66. It depends on where you pre-order it from, but it's going to be in or around that. I like the look of this. I've already pre-ordered it. I don't really have many issues with it, but Greg, what are your thoughts on the Nendoroid Aang?
Yeah, no, I like it too. I think it's a really nice design that they have for it. I mean, like you said, for an Android, if you know their style, then it's pretty much exactly what you're expecting to get from them. So, no, I like the overall look of it and the design that they have of it. I mean, I think the only thing that would have been nicer, maybe, but this could have been just if they ever do a later season, they'll have more effect parts like what they have with Korra, since they have all the elements for her. But other than that, it looks great. I mean, they have the staff as well. This is pretty cool.
Yeah, and I suppose the thing is like if you have the core in Android, I suppose those parts will roughly work with this because like you get the stand and you have all the kind of stuff to add on to that. Like you can use the little kind of wind and fire, earth parts from Korra with Aang if you want to. I assume this will probably be successful enough that they'd want to do more because it got quite high social media engagement. They obviously announce stuff quite regularly, and definitely that post has like one of the most amounts of like just feedback on the Good Smile kind of Twitter account. So I think that's definitely a good sign for us potentially getting more. I think everyone would want to see like at least like a Katara, Zuko, probably Toph, just to do like one of each bender, and then there's a lot more options to do. The only thing that's maybe a slight kind of weirdness is obviously the Avatar State head. The way it works is obviously to prevent them from having to just give you a complete extra head. It is obviously only a face swap, and obviously Aang's tattoo on his head goes all the way across. So the way they have to do it is that it blends from like white on the front of his head into blue on the top, because the back of his head is always going to be blue because they don't give you a replacement back with the Avatar State kind of colors. And similarly, it doesn't seem like you also get Avatar State hands either. But I guess that's probably the best way to do it without just giving you loads of other accessories just for that one pose. It's obviously much easier to do with the other avatars because it's just the eyes that you need to do. Whereas like with Airbender avatars, you do need to, address all parts of the arrows that are there. But what are your thoughts on that? The image, I don't know what to make of the image, and I think it does look like edited rather than like final necessarily. But what are your thoughts on how they did the Avatar State head?
Yeah, I wonder if that's edited or not. But overall, I mean, I don't know. That's a hard one because I mean, if they were to give you a full head sculpt, that would probably be like the best case scenario. But that would, understandably increase the whole price of the whole, figure. So that's pretty much out of it. And like you said, the whole hands thing, that also would be kind of weird as well. So I don't know. I mean, it looks okay. I mean, it does seem odd, knowing the character that there's like a gradient on the top of the head from the blue towards the full white. So I don't know. It might be one of those things where from like a certain angles it looks okay, but from other angles it just doesn't quite look as, screen show accurate per se. But still is a good sculpt. It still is a good pose, like the eyes and everything like that. Like it looks on brand for the type of figure that they're going for here. So other than that, I mean, it's okay. I don't know if there's like some other way they could have like added another piece or not, like a sticker or a plastic cover that would have covered the whole tattoo on the back of the head just for the sake of this part here. So I don't know.
Yeah, it would have been, I think, awkward otherwise to find some way to do it. But yeah, otherwise, like it feels like it has like a bit of everything, and I think it does work quite well. Like the picture that is the Aang hovering on top of the air scooter is really, really nice. Even though I don't think it's technically accurately like the way he uses the air scooter, and it's more like I think he's done that before with an airball, but not, he doesn't ride on the air scooter like that. So there's little things like that, but it seems like there's quite a lot of parts here. People like it, but like with everything, there's just a slight sense that like, okay, you have to start with book 1 again, book 1 Aang, when I think more people would prefer book 3 Aang. And then in this situation where we obviously found out about this and the Pop-Up Parade Korra, I think more people were looking forward to seeing the Pop-Up Parade Korra than they were this, just because I think people want to see Korra merchandise more. whereas like there's been book one Aang everything over the last year and a bit. This does still stand out, like, because Nendoroids are really cool, really collectible, but the pop-up parade core is, I think, what most people do want to see. So hopefully that will come soon. And then the only other thing I'd say on this is just, if you are interested in it, you should probably pre-order it now, because there's just so many people out there who really regret missing out on the Korra Nendoroid. Now, they might re-release it at some point. I assume they'll see pre-orders for this and maybe think we should probably re-release the Korra one, especially if the pop-up parade does well. But the price on the sort of secondary market for the Korra Nendoroid is really, really crazy, and people do want it. So let's not have this happen with the Aang one as well. Pre-order it now while you can, because a lot of them do tend to just be completely out of stock if you miss out on the pre-order and initial release window, and that's just the way they are with these. It's not that I think they have a really short run, it's just that loads of people get them. So as a collector, you need to be sort of on it for this one. But that's basically all there is there. Next piece of merchandise, U2s, who we talked about a couple of months back with their wave 1 of kind of chibi style Avatar figures, now have a wave 2 quite quickly. So these went up for pre-order April 26th. There's an Azula, there's a Zuko, there's an Avatar State Aang, there's an Appa hiding behind a bush. There's 2 Irohs, there's like kind of Fire Nation Iroh and then like T-Shop Iroh, and there's also a flocked version of the Appa. These seem cool enough, but I don't connect enough with the style here to want to get any of them, especially because they're a little bit like tricky with regards to availability. But they are doing them quite quickly, which is interesting. But do you have any thoughts on these U2s here, the Wave 2?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think it really is. I mean, I think with most of these, it really is about sort of the style and connecting it with you and just your personal preference. I mean, I think out of these, for me, I think I like the Appa the most out of these, out of this sort of line that they're running this time, just because of how they have them, the pose that they have them in, and that feels more unique to me. But other than that, yeah, I mean, overall they're fine. I think if you're into the style, then it's probably something you're gonna want to get as soon as you can.
So that's them. Next, just a random piece of merchandise I happened to spot before we started the podcast, and that is Avatar: The Last Airbender Memory Master card game. It's only like $9.99. It literally looks like it's just a pack of cards that is basically a color with a picture of the character on it, and it looks like there's maybe only the initial 6 characters. So Aang, Zuko, Katara, Toph, Appa, and the gang, and then Sokka. And I'm guessing, it doesn't really describe it, but I'm guessing this is just that memory card game that you do where you shuffle the deck, you lay the cards out in rows, and you basically take it in turns to try and pick up 2 and get pairs. And then, obviously, whoever gets the most cards at the end wins. I guess that's what this is. It seems cool enough, but obviously it's literally just stock images on colored pieces of card, so it's not that amazing. But any thoughts on this?
I don't know. I mean, the ages that the game is for is really, it's not like they're trying to like make it some sort of in-depth game or anything like that. It looks like it'd be more, it's like if you just want images of the characters on cards that you can have, maybe just to use in any sort of fashion, then this might be something that you're interested in getting. Although I think some of the other card games that we've seen have more interesting images, at least to me personally, than the ones that they've shown on these ones. That's, like you said, these literally are the stock images, and it doesn't even look like it's, at least for the the 6 that they show, these aren't even like the more updated stock images that we've seen of some of the characters sometimes. So I don't know, if that's really interesting you. But it's there and it's not expensive.
Yeah, the other games like this are the Fire Nation Rising is probably the game that looks like it's the most mechanically interesting, and like there's actually like effects and stuff like that on the cards. There's also just like kind of playing cards, basically poker cards for Avatar.
Yeah,
there's official ones that are out there. if you're interested. So yeah, I guess, and I'm pretty sure you can play that same game with those cards as well if you need to. So yeah, just more merchandise. Again, it's all book one Avatar stock imagery stuff. The stuff we usually expect. That's just getting a little bit boring as we go on, and there's very little Korra stuff. In that, if that Memory Master thing was just Korra, I think people would probably be a lot more interested in getting it just to have Korra merchandise. But there's that. We'll switch from merchandise over to a little bit of Netflix Avatar news. It's literally just that Avatar Roku has been cast. C.S. Lee is going to be playing Roku. I think Avatar News got the exclusive information on this. That's really all there is here. Like, we don't have like the casting information on like what the role of Roku in this show is going to be, but we were kind of maybe a little bit worried that, okay, we've heard about Kyoshi, we've heard about Karuk being cast in this show, no Roku, but no, they have cast Roku. So yeah, that seems fine completely. So yeah, they have, I guess 4 avatars cast now for the show technically, so that's cool. Again, I don't think I'm super. I don't think I know this actor, so I'm sure he'll be good, I guess. But anything to add here about the Roku casting?
Nah, nothing for me.
Yeah, so yeah, it's just that they're getting the cast together. I think filming is meant to go on for, I think, just another month, maybe 2. So they're getting towards the end of like, I suppose, the initial filming stuff. So, hopefully there's more of a kind of reveal about stuff. We start to see some costumes to get a sense for what it's actually like. So far, everything's just been like actors so far. Now we get into probably one of the most interesting news pieces we've had in a while with regards to just like what's going on. So Free Comic Book Day is next Saturday. It's a week from today. There is an Avatar and Korra comic for Free Comic Book Day. So that's the main thing to get across. But up until like earlier this week, basically, I guess, we didn't actually know what the comic was about. It was just this nice image of Aang, but just Aang on the cover. We had 2 creative teams listed, and information very much suggesting that they would be 2 completely unique stories that we had not heard before. That was what we knew before. They told us that. Then, obviously, April 13th hits, and that's the day that basically comic book stores get the free comic books in. So some places started to put them up on eBay. People purchased it, and obviously the fandom, the news started to spread. So we found out what was actually in the book. The Korra book is in there, no problem. Creative team is just Meredith McLaren, basically on her own. And the story is called Beach Wars. It's a 10-page, brand new short story about most of the characters having like a prank war on the beach. The unique part of this story is that it actually turns out that the Avatar section of the book is actually just 10 preview pages from Chibi Comics Volume 1, Aang's Unfreezing Day. And everyone was shocked and disappointed by this, and there's just weirdness happening around it. There's a little bit more to explain, but we'll just get some of the reactions here at the start. So, Greg, what were your thoughts when you found out the information about, like, okay, this is what's in the book compared to, like, the news and build-up we had?
That's a good question. I mean, I think like a lot of people, I was just a little bit sort of, confused or just not quite understanding what was really meant to be. I mean, again, it's not like we really knew a lot of what was going to be in this book to begin with. So maybe that might have, helped if we actually had like at least a little bit of that ahead of time, rather than seeing these images pop up online and just seeing like the initial pages of them. So it doesn't really help in the terms of like clarity of things, which I think is something that we're always sort of talking about. So that probably could have helped a lot to work on. But I definitely can understand some of the initial, I guess, sort of disappointed reactions when getting this, getting a new Avatar comic, and we haven't had one in a long time, and expecting to be something, different or new than what we have already known about.
So the reason that especially that this became such a kind of big issue is that people went back and checked to make absolutely sure that there's no way that we just missed that, like, this could have been a preview for the Avatar comic, the Chibi comic. But no, Dark Horse put up a blog post in around the time the full cover for this book was revealed. And in that post, which is still up, unedited, the Avatar The Last Airbender short story will be written by Amy Chu and illustrated by Kicking Shoes, while the Legend of Korra short story will be written and illustrated by Meredith McLaren. Now, Amy Chu and Kicking Shoes are not involved in the creative team for the Chibi comic. So straight away, this tells us that they're only like a month before the comic shops actually got the books. There was a new Avatar story meant to be in this. When this news came out, the admin for the Facebook page Avatar 1 basically messaged Dark Horse officially on Facebook and asked, basically, what's the deal with this book? People have the book and they're saying that it's a preview and not the short story by Amy Chu. What's the deal? And they responded saying that the comic will include the Amy Chu short story. And everyone was just kind of like, we've seen the evidence, like, it's not in there. So I don't think there's been a follow-up to this, but it's kind of crazy that, that seems like a relatively confident to the point the book is in there when it's not in there. So what's happened here? This does not help Dark Horse with regards to us feeling that their communication is, like, terrible, in that this has to have been a relatively recent change, but I don't know how you get it so wrong when, like, just a month beforehand you're saying information about this. People literally have the book and now you're saying the same thing when it's not the case. I don't know. What are your thoughts on this and how the communication is so bad that even Dark Horse themselves are not sure what's in the book?
Yeah, I don't know. This is like an ongoing thing, right? Where we're just not quite reaching, on the same level in terms of, like, understanding, which is, understandably a bit, frustrating for people who are trying to follow this and really are going out of their way to get this, even if it is a free comic book, you still have to go and try to get it and hope that you can get it at, whatever local store you're trying to get to. So I don't know. It's an odd predicament that they're sort of, I guess, trying to put people that are trying to support, these comics and, the productions that are coming from it. And if, the people who clearly have the book are saying this, then it just seems like it's a really odd situation to be in. And it, sort of makes you wonder, what happened with this sort of last minute change, or if there's something that we're really sort of missing because we don't really have the full picture. But it's only like a week until we get to see it, for everyone else. So I don't know, it's a really odd situation.
Yeah, and it's doubly confusing because the only way it makes any sense for them to put the preview pages for the Chibi comic in here is that the delay for that book was, like, always kind of in a way meant to be the case. So because that book was originally scheduled for, like, July last year, and so it can only be in here if it was locked in that this book was going to be delayed for, like, 11 months to get it to this point. And again, that would make sense. Like, okay, its release date is after Free Comic Book Day to promote it ahead of time. But now that book's still relatively far away in August. It might change dates again. I think it has gone through a full kind of month cycle without changing dates, so I hopefully it will stick to it now, especially now that preview pages are out, which basically confirm the book is done, I guess. I haven't seen it go up for, like, review copy request from where I usually will get review copies from, so that's a kind of weird thing. But I think that's more of a factor of it's 4 months, well, 3 months before that book comes out, whereas it's more like 2 months is usually when it happens. So there's that whole situation, which is kind of annoying. The other thing is that they they had an update, obviously, like I said, in March, start of March, about Amy Chu Kicking Shoes. Kicking Shoes is the cover artist, and they were saying that they were also going to be the interior artist. So I'm guessing this book exists, but for whatever reason, it maybe didn't come together in time, and they had to quickly change it out. But then what's the deal with this story if, like, the social media people are still saying it's a thing? Now, this is where I suppose we maybe don't know what information the social media people have access to versus, like, say, the editors who are the ones, like, interacting with the publisher in terms of deciding what's in the book, in that they might have just checked literally the post I'm reading off now to say that, like, oh no, the listing says that book is in here, when, like, I don't think that they've changed any of the listings, whether it be like the comics one or the blog post, to say that the Avatar section is a preview. So I don't know what the situation is. The only thing I can maybe think of is, like, is there any chance that the digital release of this book actually has the new story in it and it just missed the deadline for printing? I don't think that would be the case, but is there a chance? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that would be, I definitely wouldn't expect that. Like, they seem, at least from everything that we've seen before, they've been really set on the digital and the print, versions, like matching and, delaying which ones come out when in order to, like, time things, which they seem to have, like, recently, let up on and stuff like that. So I would be hard pressed to see them doing something along those lines. That would be very unique for them.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, very, very weird situation, and it really has cut down excitement for the Free Comic Book Day book. Just people knowing that, like, oh, this is all it is. And I've obviously, like, read the free comic book because someone who got it on eBay sent me the pages, and I did a review, and I wasn't super impressed by the Korra, the new Korra story, and then the preview pages are like, that book is kind of exactly what you expect it to be. So it's a pretty just like, oh, we wait a while for new comic content and this is all it is. I'm guessing because the Avatar story was meant to be the cover story, it was the more serious of the two stories. And so it being, like, exchanged for, the chibi comic is just a real, like, tonal shift in that it's just this book of fun stuff rather than having any sense of, like, anything notable in it. It does ask the question though now, what's the deal with this new short story? Like, when are we going to see it? Has it been held back because of Avatar Studios stuff again? Now, I think just with the timing of everything with regards to, well, if the chibi comic has been delayed enough to be able to be put into this book as preview pages, then I'm pretty convinced at this point that the Korra short story is going to be in Patterns in Time. Otherwise, like, it just feels kind of weird that one Korra story is going to miss the collection of short stories. But what are your thoughts on that? Do you think there's any chance that Beach Wars makes it into Patterns in Time?
Maybe that's why everything's been sort of pushed around so much so that things could fit together. I mean, I don't know. It seems likely that would be, something that they would want to include with it, unless it's just going to be like the odd one out for whatever reason. So I wouldn't be surprised to see it in it.
Yeah, because that's sort of the situation we have with Avatar comics at the moment. Matcha Maker's last year's Avatar comic isn't like, you can't buy that in like a physical book unless you like just purchase the last year's Free Comic Book Day issue. It's not collected in anything. So now there's that, and there's Mystery Story. Korra could have one story out on its own. But either way, this ATLA short story joins like the mystery Korra comic trilogy from the last 2 years as like these stories that clearly got some stage into production to the point where they were talking about it or just about ready to talk about it, that effectively exist out there but don't exist. So there's 4 books in the void effectively for Avatar at this point, and that's just weird. Which brings us into this interesting tweet in that Dark Horse don't tend to respond to people all that much, but someone asked them, what's the deal with this? The core comic that you basically announced years ago, there was a little bit of back and forth to clarify what the situation is, and they eventually gave this response. We can only confirm official announcements, which are made when details are in place and approved by all partners. There have been a lot of changes with Nickelodeon and Avatar Studios, so news has been slower. But again, we'll update officially when we can on any further items. So, PR response, but at least they said something. In that, I think that's probably one of the first times I think Dark Horse have said Avatar Studios, so that's some sense of progress. Because other than that, we've just been assuming Avatar Studios has affected the comics. Because I think the only thing we knew officially for sure was that the reason we got the one-shot comics is because they said it on stream that Mike and Brian requested them to switch from the trilogies to the one-shots. We never got any update on effectively why things are slow, but now they've confirmed that it's because of Avatar Studios, I guess, figuring stuff out. So at least we know that. It obviously doesn't say anything about what to expect or anything like that, but it's something. So what are your thoughts on this rare reply from Dark Horse here?
Yeah, I mean, it's not surprising. We've been saying this kind of, is probably going to be the reason why things are sort of up in the air or being delayed or being pushed back. And, it makes sense. There's, other forces at play here. There's a bigger thing that they're working on that, we know is happening. So, it's just sort of, when is it all going to fall into line with each other is really the big question, and that's what we're really sort of waiting on here. So it is nice for them to sort of give an official, reply back. I don't know, for some people that won't really mean that much, but, it's nice to at least know that, there are other forces that you have to sort of wait on before they announce anything, which, from all the other additional media like the tabletop role-playing games, stuff like that, like we know that they are all working and that there is a process to get things approved. So that's just sort of how it goes.
And then, to be a slight bit critical on the statement, they really emphasize at the end the term official, as in what are you doing, making out that a non-official announcement is an actual announcement, when we've discussed those at length. Your main editor on Avatar and Korra comics, directly saying that the next books for Korra will be a Korra comic trilogy. We're not meant to trust the editor saying that. Especially when, Dark Horse, never officially announced their books. So, what did they mean by, an official announcement? Because, I'll bring it up. Beast of the Four Nations. What is the current status of that book? I posted about this on Twitter, noting that it's 11 months since that book was announced. But was it announced? Or did we just find out about it? And what's the difference between those two things? Because that book's not on the Dark Horse website. I don't think Dark Horse have ever posted about it on any social media. I believe most places who've been updating their listing for that book don't actually have it available to pre-order anymore. And it doesn't have an official release date. But everyone who's in the fandom has known about that book for a full year. So has that book been officially announced? Because we have a cover for that, but no official statement. Yet the trilogy was effectively officially announced without having media properly come out about it. So there's that weirdness about what is an announcement really? But what are your thoughts on that? When they say an official announcement, what do they really mean by it? Do they mean a listing on their website?
Yeah, no, that's a good point to bring up there, because official can really mean anything, and depending on, I guess, sort of the type of media that it is, some things can seem more official than others. And, we always are sort of looking, so we sort of find things on the side, or, when they go on the websites before they make sort of a news post, doesn't need to be something from a IGN or a comic book resource where that's considered the official, or do we have to wait for a panel or something like that where that'll be considered sort of the official, but that's usually always accompanied by, another sort of news media outlet posting some information of it as well. So I don't know. That's it's curious that they're saying that, but I don't know. For me, it just makes it seem like they're really trying to sort of like, I guess, put it in our minds that this is like a bigger situation than what it was before, when they were just sort of doing the comics on, almost sort of like on their own. Like, they always have to have input from Mike and Brian, and, through Viacom, the whole Nickelodeon situation that has always sort of been around. But now that I guess that they're working on more of a sort of, the movies and the TVs are back into play of things, that things have to be sort of, controlled via that sort of, I guess, sort of media release schedule, rather than the way that they used to do it, which, as far as like what you were saying before, it's just sort of like they just put it on their website and it's just there, or maybe they'll give it to one of the news media websites, and that'll be sort of the main output for it. Now it seems like it has to go through like more higher ups and more through the studio itself directly. Now that actually is a thing, rather than just being Mike and Brian before.
Yeah. And then I look at this emphasis on the term official statement, and then we go back to the previous thing we were talking about. The Avatar: The Last Airbender short story will be written by Amy Chu and illustrated by Kicking Shoes. And it's like, and then, like, they're directly replying to people saying the comic will include this story. And then I look over here in this document that I have that is literally pictures of all the pages, and Amy Chu is not listed on the creators page for the free comic, like, at all. So there's that situation there. Like, okay, it's one thing making an official statement, but that's not really making a statement on how good their communication is. So yeah, we're just waiting for stuff. But it's not good, and there have been people sort of sticking up for Dark Horse, over the year with everything that's happening. But this was definitely one of those ones where I was just glad to see people just be like, "What are you doing, Dark Horse? Like, this is just like next level, like." Pretty much like feeling like incompetence at this point, because the communication is so bad about this book, when it all could have been just solved by, there is a official description for the free comic on the inside of the free comic, and I think I mentioned this last year as well. Why don't you just put that description up on the website, the one that actually says what the book is about slightly? It's still just like a little preview thing that just mentions that, like, in the Korra story, fun on the beach, basically. And that way at least people know what to expect, rather than like getting a surprise reveal that, oh, one potential for like a proper Avatar comic this year is actually just a preview for the only other Avatar comic this year. Not great. But yeah, that's it for the news. Other than that, yeah, we're just waiting for like kind of preview pages for things like first excerpt of the Yang Chen novel. Who knows when that will actually come out, but should be hopefully within the next couple of weeks. And then yeah, the Free Comic Book Day itself is next Saturday. So on the next podcast, we will be reviewing the book, Beach Wars, and I guess we'll have our discussion on the preview pages for the Chibi comic as well, which is a bit of a weird one. We can't really call that a review as such, because it's just a preview, but we'll do the discussion. But for now, we'll move into our Avatar: The Last Airbender re-review here. So we're going to be reviewing 101, The Boy and the Iceberg, and 102, The Avatar Returns here. So basically the same as we did with Korra, but for Avatar. And then again, review segments going forward will be one Avatar episode, one Korra episode. So that way we're actually doing the both side by side and can have a cool comparison situation. So, first episode, Boy and the Iceberg. It's interesting to go back to like the very first ever episode of Avatar. Like with Korra, I don't get like that much of an opportunity to like just sit down and watch episodes. That's not just sort of specific clips or stuff like that. So just sitting down and watch the original two was like, yeah, these are really good. But it also does highlight that I don't think for Avatar, these first two episodes are really that close to the best of the episodes in Avatar. in that like 101, for instance. I looked on my list. I have this rated at like as like my 49th episode out of 61 on my list. It's still in the kind of higher categories in terms of like ABC, S rank categorization, but it's relatively towards the bottom here. It's not quite bottom 10, but it's close. But I think it just speaks to the high quality of Avatar that even the first episode, which is actually good, isn't really considered the best. I don't think too many people in the fandom, go crazy for this first episode, in that I think Welcome to Republic City is a better opening episode. Like, there's more to it because there's more interesting dynamics going on, whereas this has to play the role of like being a good character introduction and getting across what the franchise is about, as well as not overloading you with all the kind of lore elements and stuff like that. So, what are your opening thoughts here on going back to the first episode of Avatar? How does it stack up for you against, like, say, Korra's opening and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think you make a good point there in terms of it, maybe not being sort of the strongest out of, the whole show overall, which, usually the early episodes really aren't the strongest that you would per se for a series, especially since, when things start getting moving, then they're more interested overall. But I don't know, it does a job of, introducing to the characters, and it does, like you said, gives you a little bit of the lore, but not sort of overwhelming you too much. But I think when you look back at it, it might not have as much meat as you really might have thought it might have had when you first sort of watched it. So it was interesting to see it from that perspective, and thinking about it now, especially with, how shows now do, the openings, and just how, I guess just sort of how media has changed and animation has changed overall in terms of just general storytelling, comparing this when it came out, so many years ago, to how more shows are produced now, and the ones that have taken inspiration from it, and ones who have just done their completely own thing, trying to not imitate it at all. It's curious to sort of go back to it and think of it from that perspective, I guess.
Yeah, I definitely found watching these and sort of trying to take notes, a lot of the notes were just kind of like, okay, I'm just kind of recapping the plot here. Oh, here's this like fact that I think everyone at this point knows, but is always sort of interesting to note, that like, oh hey, Aang's not on the rock in the intro, but he is in all the other episodes because he's found as the Avatar after that. And it's like, oh yeah, that was cool, like, 15 years ago when people really began to notice it, but like, on the re-review here, it's just kind of like, okay, yeah, we can go past that. So it's kind of tricky to do with this one, because like, at least with the Korra episodes, we can bring in like all the material in terms of like the transition from Avatar to Korra, bring in the comics. Here though, we don't actually have like much content addressing like the build up to ATLA as such, in that it's a lot of like background kind of lore, and then a couple of the characters do have like flashback stuff. That means that like, as the series goes on, we do get to know them a bit better. So, like, we obviously now have the context that, oh yeah, we know the full story about why Aang is in the iceberg. And it's interesting that this episode gives you most of it, just not the context behind why he, like, ran away in the first place. But oh, he was flying, fell into the ocean, iceberg, that's how it happened. We find out in the episode that, like, Katara's mother is gone. The opening narration tells us that their father is just away at war. But they don't explore too much about, like, what Hakoda's doing necessarily. You get tiny bits of it when Sokka goes to meet him in season 2. It takes him to, like, right at the end of the show, like, episodes before the finale, to find out the details about what happened to Kaya. So those are the things that are very interesting to consider, that for Katara, like, her mother is such an important thing to her as a character. They hold off until to tell you that story. So what are some of those things that just interest you about this opening episode, based on what we know now about the characters, that, theoretically they probably could have actually told us here, but actually told us at a different point?
Yeah, I mean, I think most of that, it makes sense that they wouldn't, necessarily dump that on you at the beginning. But, going back to this now and seeing, sort of the hesitance of the characters just because, just understandably, they literally just met this, random airbending kid who, hasn't been around or, they thought that all the airbenders were gone for hundreds of years. You know, it sort of, I guess puts it into, I guess, a little bit more the context of how, I guess, they sort of view the world at that current point in time, which I think is, it's a good point to establish. And, we're looking at it probably, more critically than you would have necessarily thought of this on the first run through, especially since, it is a kid's show. It is aimed at kids. So it's not necessarily trying to go, that deep into it. It's just trying to make it sort of like interesting and fun. And, it definitely gives you a bit of that and shows you a little bit of sort of the playfulness that will go on later on. But, it is, I guess, right now, looking at it now, we can sort of understand where it's going. But it is, I think for the most part, it is pretty, surface level, I guess, which, makes sense. But I think that's something to, I don't know, it's something that came up to me as, in terms of like looking at it now as towards where it actually goes, which, makes you wonder, how it would have, would have fit if it comes out, later on, compared to when it originally aired.
Hmm. The first, I suppose, specific thing I want to get into is just that the show is called Avatar: The Last Airbender, and we always talk about how like we wanted to tell more stories about in or around the Air Nomad genocide. It is interesting how they, in any way, tackle that in the show, in that the loss of Aang's people kind of is a thing that gets brought up like maybe once, twice a season, if that, and you never fully get the context necessarily. Like the show, it obviously you eventually get the idea that like, oh yeah, the Fire Nation killed all of the airbenders. Like that becomes clear in like episode 3, and then you have like the guru stuff where you literally see the idea of like, look at Aang's loss, look how much of the people that he knew are gone. But in this first episode, the only real like allusion to it you get is just that the Water Tribe are a little surprised to see an airbender. Like, oh, no one's seen an airbender in a long time. And then that one shot right at the end of like the extended opening from Katara that shows you like an air temple burning, as like, okay, I sort of get this. But also that like this is a Nickelodeon show, and everyone makes the point that Avatar does not feel like at all like a Nickelodeon show. And so the title literally referring to a genocide having taken place that they can never really refer to, it's always a bit of a weird dynamic in that they can never really tell that story. Even to this day, they haven't actually revealed the details of what happened necessarily. So I always like to sort of focus in on that as like a kind of key world building element, that Aang, like the plot depends on Aang being missing for a while, there being no airbenders left, and everyone knowing that if they do encounter an airbender, it is the Avatar, but they never go into it too much. What are your thoughts on sort of the Air Nomad genocide being sort of the event that makes the series happen, but that they never really touch on it?
Yeah, no, I think you brought up an interesting dynamic there in terms of, the context of the show, who is geared for, who's aimed for. It's really, they have to sort of, I guess you could say like tiptoe around it more or less, because it's just something that, even though it adds a lot of depth and a lot of intrigue to the show, and it makes Aang as a character stand out from the rest of the world because he, as far as they know, is the only one, that exists of the air nomads, is something that, I don't know, you can't really, I guess, sort of tackle in a more direct approach here. And, you can tell from, Aang's, how they, gear Aang in this episode, how he's, reluctant to say that he is the Avatar, to sort of push it all around. Even when they sort of first bring up the idea of the war in the episode, they have him sort of like scream at the penguins that, he wants to slide on here. So I think, that is a good point to bring up, that's what draws a lot of people to the show. But I think, they, especially early on, they sort of cover that up, just because that's just sort of the nature of how they're, writing the story.
Yeah, and then similarly, like I suppose the presentation of like the Fire Nation and what exactly it is that they've done, like why the war is happening in the first place. Again, it's crazy that like it takes until season 3, episode 6 for you to actually just get, oh, this is why it happened in the first place. Otherwise, it's just like, okay, powerful nation wanting to take over, they target the weaker nations initially, and so the result of that is that airbenders are gone. The south has been like decimated, but it's just about fighting on, and then there's just a sense that, okay, no contact with the north, but it's probably in place, and then we find out it is actually pretty safe, and that's that dynamic. Um, it's it's one of those ones that I'm very interested to see as we go through the episodes again. Really focusing on the idea of like this show, from my memory and the amount of times I've seen it, doesn't really focus much on like the war that's actually going on. In that we see very few, like, obviously engagements, of course, between the like Earth Kingdom and the Fire Nation. Now, obviously, it's 100 years into the war. A lot of the main events are things that happen in the early years. Then Azulon takes over and he doubles down the attack on the water tribes. So we're more in this sort of state where, okay, there's a few holdouts in the Earth Kingdom that are tough to break down. So there's not too much that's super active happening in the war, but it is implied that it is going on in the background, that towns in the Earth Kingdom are getting taken over like all the time. So that's going to be interesting to see as we go on. But do you have any thoughts on that, like what they do or kind of rather don't say about specifically the Fire Nation, especially given that like Zuko, I think it's pretty clear from this episode, like he's presented as the Fire Nation here, but it's definitely very different than like Katara says in the narration, that the Fire Nation attacked, and then Zuko's just this one guy basically here.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point there. Just how widespread is, sort of this war, which I think, sort of leads into like, Sokka's like initial like not understanding of how Aang doesn't understand that there is a war, which, of course we understand that, Aang's been frozen for 100 years. So of course he wouldn't have known anything about it, or, to the widespread of what it actually is here. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, when you first see, Zuko arrive, I think, they do a pretty good job of just trying to show like the imposing nature of, the Fire Nation. I mean, granted, this is like a small village, but I think, their idea is just showing the comparison of, how strong the Fire Nation is compared to the rest of the world, which, isn't necessarily, a good one-to-one representation, as we sort of see later on with the nations that are able to hold out for the 100 years of the war so far. But I think, in terms of them getting that point across, this episode does a good job of at least indicating a little bit of that, while still not really giving you the full understanding, either because of just the nature of the show or just because of how they want to tell the story.
Mm-hmm. What is a topic about the first episode you want to bring up?
So yes, I think I'll switch just to sort of go more towards, I guess, just sort of the village and the state of it right now, and which, sort of leads into just sort of what we've been talking about in terms of like the war overall. But really, I don't know. I think I was really, for this one, I really was interested in sort of Sokka and just sort of his, I guess, his sort of state of believing of where the war stands, and how, he's trying to work with, the other, younger men of the village, in terms of the preparation, and, what we do see later on when Zuko does come into play, and just sort of how, he's so, which is, this is his whole character art, how like incredulous that he's believing everything that's been happening, with Aang and the airbending and, the magic water, and just the whole idea of bending. So I guess sort of the state of the village in terms of how, through the lens of how Sokka's viewing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like Sokka's like arc is very interesting here, because Sokka's a character I feel like if you try to do the kind of initial presentation of him like nowadays, I'm wondering could you actually get people to like properly like him? Because just the idea that you actually like give the
Hmm.
character this element of like he is sexist to a certain degree, and they kind of get away with it here because it's more just sort of banter between him and his sister, and like okay, these things happen. But then like well, as we'll get to, like when we get to episode 4, like they kind of double down on it, but that's also the when they get him past it. I do often wonder, like, if Sokka was done here 2022, would people be so quick to really, really like the character that much if they did that? I think they'd have to do it slightly differently to make it work. But it is interesting, just like it's a case for Sokka and Katara that they stand out in the village because they're the only like teenagers in the village. There's like there seems to be like a lot of kind of like mothers, small kids, and then elderly people. And so Sokka is literally the only sort of like man left in the village who's not like an elderly person. So that I think helps to inform a lot of that. The fact that like his kind of training is incomplete, but his father has placed like you're kind of the kind of in a way warrior leader of the tribe while I'm gone, which is kind of like an informal thing, but he really takes it to heart. And you see both
Hmm.
the idea that like he buys into it too much in terms of like over exaggerating his skill, but does sort of like represent it quite well in that he is actually brave. And I think kind of what gets a little bit lost in this is that he is skilled. It's just that he goes up against like basically a master in Zuko. Because in the next episode we'll see that Zuko is actually like super skilled. If Zhao's a master and Zuko can beat him, what does that say about like Sokka doing okay against him? Um, that's always been an interesting thing because Sokka never gets like training as such. Like he gets a little bit from Suki, but not enough that it would take him from sort of, as some people maybe present him, like bumbling idiot warrior to being actually quite skilled. He doesn't get the formal training until like season 3, and even then that's sword specific. And Piandao sort of only takes him on because of some shown potential in the first place. So um, it's an interesting kind of way they do the presentation here of like he has to be somewhat competent, but he also has to lose quite badly to Zuko. So, um, but that's where I think the following episodes do an okay job at like when they go up against like all their kind of more random people. Sokka is able to, as he says, knock a few heads along the way, and improves along the way with everyone like that. It's his destiny too to join the group. It's not just the sort of Katara Aang thing, and I do like that. Um, so I do like that they play it with the idea that like there's an element of like he himself is maybe being a little bit sort of childish with the way he acts as a leader with all the others, but he is sort of sincere in wanting to truly protect the village, and he does the best that he can. So it's an interesting one, but I do like that. Otherwise, we get sort of skeptical Sokka throughout this, which it is an interesting one as as the kind of series goes on, and that he remains that way, but he's actually a character who ends up going to the spirit world in a later episode and sees all the bending stuff to the point where he's kind of like an expert on it by the time he's older. So they do a lot of interesting stuff with Sokka when you kind of reflect on it. And as for the village itself, I think it is very interesting to sort of kind of note a lot of the kind of newer material that we have, where like from say North and South as well as the Legends RPG game. This isn't the only part of the South that's left. There are other places that are kind of further in, which is the North and South stuff, and then there's also the secret one that's referenced in Legends as well. That's the kind of cave system one. So they're still like there in all of this. It's just that this is, I suppose, effectively what Wolf Cove, what's left of it. But there are other places. It's just things are so bad. The individual tribes of the South aren't super connected themselves, which is interesting to note. But still, it's a pretty shocking scene when Aang is brought back to the village and Katara is literally able to be just like, Aang, entire village, Aang, and it's about like 20 people at most. That's how crazy things are. And that even if you had like all the men back, it'd only be like 40 people at most. So really, really kind of crazy how bad things are in the south. But what are some of your thoughts on like the opening portrayal here of Sokka?
Yeah, no, I don't know. It's like you said when you were starting, like the idea of this sort of character in our current, way that we're doing stories. I do wonder how they would have to, or if they would at all, tweak them, because I think, there's something to be said for a character who can grow and evolve over time. But I guess it's really how you portray those initial sort of, off-putting characteristics to where they can actually learn and grow from there. And there are plenty of shows that do it a lot sort of worse than this. I think this is probably like I said, the fact that it is sort of his sister that is sort of like taking the brunt of things for the most part, at least. I think that lessens the blow per se, rather than if it was just some random person like we do see later on. But of course, that is sort of when his change does, start to become more apparent. But even his, I guess sort of reluctance with Aang from the initial, just like, wondering, is the staff a weapon? Not believing that, Appa can fly, which eventually we do see how that does work later on. All goes to show how much, I guess, potential growth that Sokka could have. Now, just from these first two episodes, I'm not sure, I guess, by the end of 2, you do get to see a little of that and understanding, at least in terms of his family with Katara. But, overall, I don't know, how much, not having any understanding of the rest of where things going, how much favoritism you would show towards Sokka. And yeah, it is interesting about sort of the village, not being the only one, which, when we're all first watching this for the first time, I don't think that's something that you necessarily understand, that there are other ones out there. It makes it seem like it's pretty isolated, other than the fact that that there is a north out there somewhere, and that the world at large is huger. But I don't know, it really, I think for this one, I guess, maybe that was just a whole sort of point, or, they hadn't even thought of the idea of there being other southern villages there. This, almost seems like this wouldn't necessarily be, the end of it, other than when you do find the Northern Warden tribe later on. So I don't know, maybe that's sort of a thing that they're trying to cue in on, just in terms of, the airbenders being, almost completely wiped out, and, even the Southern Border tribe looks like it might, die out pretty soon as well.
Yeah, and then a lot of people bring up, like, oh, why don't we see the spirit portals in Avatar? Well, part of that is obviously that we focus on a village that is basically, pretty close to the sea, given that, like, a port is built here later on.
Yeah.
So they're really far away from the tundra, and it like literally is like that the spirit portals are sort of on the actual poles themselves. So that explains it, for like they barely go into the tundra at all, so why would they go all the way through the tundra? That's why we don't see them. And then of course they don't get brought up because the plot isn't about opening the portals in terms of going directly to the physical spirit world. And because they're closed, of course, you're not going to see anything like crazy from like a distance with them. So like it's always been a little bit of a like, why are they adding on like these major lore things? Well, because they don't tell us all the lore in Avatar. Like this episode, like getting into some of those lore topics, like it gives you a decent foundation in that like you can understand a lot of dynamics without them just directly telling you these are the rules of how bending works, in that Iroh gives Zuko a bit of advice that is specifically about firebending, but is the essence of how bending works. So he's like, breath is the focus. Breath becomes energy in the body. Energy extends past your limbs and becomes fire. So it creates this idea like, okay, bending is manipulating energy, extending it past your limbs. For fire, you create the fire. For the other bending forms, it's like connecting to that element. That's fine. You get little moments like, say, Katara and Aang having the conversation about like, oh, Katara as like a beginner bender is like, oh, Aang, you're an airbender. Can you teach me bending? And he has to kind of point out that I'm an airbender, you're a waterbender. I can't really teach you that, but we can try, I guess. Um, but he's aware you will need a master to actually do anything. So that's quite good as well. And just highlighting the kind of differences of like, okay, you straight away get a sense for sort of the limitations of bending. That, okay, Katara can like levitate a ball of water, but you require a special power like Aang has as the Avatar to do this giant water spout thing and do wild things. So it creates like a bit of a distinction, and so it's clear like the scope of powers and that sort of thing. But yeah, they don't tell you like every single thing. You just have to learn it kind of from context, which is sort of still the way it goes. Like, oh, the simple dynamic that Katara and Sokka are brother and sister, one's a bender, one's a non-bender. That's interesting. Not everyone, just because you're from the tribe based on the elemental names, doesn't mean everyone's a bender, and that's good to know as well. So, what are your thoughts on how they do a lot of that sort of like fundamental lore of Avatar, of like basically what the Avatar is and what bending is? How much do you feel we get from this first episode?
No, that's interesting to note there. I mean, you do, from the way that they're describing, the way that you see Aang use his bending, which I think is probably like the strongest one that you can see there, especially since, even the kids in the village, they think that is magic because they're just so unaware of it, and it's not like this visual thing that you can readily see, even though us as the viewer, we can see how they're trying to illustrate it to us. In person, it would almost seem like there's nothing really going on there. So I don't know. I think, they make it seem like there's some control over it. There's a way that you're able to manipulate it. Aang needs to use his glider in order to actually manipulate the air current so that he can fly along with it. So, they give you those sort of base level understandings to the people there and you as the viewer of how it actually works, which I think for the most part, is something that you can understand even if you don't know all of the specific details and the ins and out of it, which eventually you do get more and more information and understanding on those. But I think for the purposes of this first episode here and the three elements that we see being bent, you can sort of grasp the initial sort of concepts. You don't quite see sort of like the upper limits of it. You see a little bit more of it in the second episode, but it's still sort of, base level what they're able to do without, giving you everything in the beginning.
Yeah. And we do also get, I suppose, a more, one of the more technical, I suppose, things about where a bender is in their training, that Zuko wants to move on to the advanced set of firebending moves. Yet in the next episode, he's going to like defeat a master. So it kind of highlights that Zuko is just on that verge of sort of becoming what is like considered a bending master, which admittedly is not a very well defined thing in the series, in that by that logic, basically every character of note we see is a master bender. Obviously, airbending, we actually have some technical stuff about like the 36 or whatever levels of airbending there is, and the tattoos are obviously the key way to do that. But with the other elements, it's a lot of like, well, Toph didn't have like official formal training, but he's clearly a master bender and these type of things. But interesting to note Zuko, where Zuko is, given that, as we learn, he is a extreme like late bloomer as a bender. He was not like talented when he was younger at all. Even like getting to like, a relatively old age, it is like the last couple of years, his like drive to capture the Avatar and the training he's undergone with Iroh, that's what's taken him to this level. And it's, I suppose, also a little bit of an insight that Iroh's a very good teacher. Even though he's obviously struggling with just how intense Zuko actually is, in that Iroh's trying to teach him like proper firebending technique, whereas Zuko, his character in this episode, feels more like it's leaning towards the Zhao, Ozai, angry firebending style. But Iroh's doing like just enough to sort of rein Zuko in to kind of teach him like the correct way. And even in like the fight in episode 2, you sort of see a little bit of it. He kind of does the break his root thing when he knocks Aang off the air scooter by kind of going low with the kind of a little bit of the breakdancing stuff beginning to come out. So there's this kind of hints that are kind of quite good. And then, like you say, Aang as the like true kind of master we see Ben in this episode. You do get a really good insight into like, oh, okay, yeah, that's what you can do. Admittedly, you know, obviously airbending is the really sort of like innovative kind of form of bending, but Aang demonstrates that quite well here also. But yeah, did you have any more thoughts on sort of like how bending is done in these early episodes?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of the whole mastery and seeing Aang's skill, especially when he's escaping, I think it really gives you a good insight, like you were saying, into what you can actually do with your bending. I mean, think even Zuko, when he has to sort of, you know, be a little bit more creative in the enclosed area, you know, you get to see a little bit of more of what he can, you know, sort of think up on the fly, especially later on when you do see him working with Iroh, which, you know, you could argue that, you know, Iroh or even Zuko by himself could have, you know, created that sort of larger size blast at the end. But, you know, it does show a little bit of sort of how, you know, two benders can actually work together as well, which I think is something cool of note that, you know, eventually gets expanded upon later on. But no, I think it's a fun episode that gives you maybe just enough of the bending to keep you intrigued. I think that, you know, for a lot of people, you know, of course, you know, it's one of the larger things of the Avatar universe in general. So the fact that they do have it in the first two here, I think is probably one of the stronger points to keep in mind if the whole overall episode might not necessarily stand out to you, or the first two episodes stand out to you as being particularly strong, which I know for some people, you know, isn't quite enough to keep them going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think these episodes do a good job at getting across what I think is probably the most unique thing with bending, and that is just the sort of the style that best suits each element, in that you see basically the defensive style based on evasion going up against like the most aggressive style here, so air versus fire. And I love the kind of, in a way, contrast that in the engagement that Aang and Zuko have in the contained room, Aang dodges his way to victory, even though it's probably like not suited for his style, yet sort of open out on the deck of the ship, where he maybe has more space to move, he does get sort of locked in place having to defend, and that's how Zuko wins the second engagement. But he's able to maneuver his way around Zuko in that room and get the victory in that sense. That you see, like, okay, airbenders need to keep on the move to defend, but then can do some very kind of clever things with regards to like movement enhancement and you know, that sort of thing. But firebenders kind of are more direct, so you know, it's that cool counter style thing that goes on here. And then even just a little thing like right at the end, showing that Katara actually has potential as a bender, that she does an ice move out of nowhere that you didn't maybe even know was like a thing with water bending. That, okay, it's not just liquid water, they can actually like turn it into ice if they need to. In that, no one thought her that move, she just tried to do it. Got it wrong the first time, adjusted, got it right, showing that like early potential, and I do like that. One thing I do want to bring up is the way Aang is found in the ice is, I think, interesting in that in a way it sort of comes from like the flaws of both Sokka and Katara, in that Sokka fails at ice dodging, which leads to them ending up on that sort of like floating bit of ice out there, and then Katara lets her emotions sort of get the best of her, but that powering her bending is what leads to the ice being disturbed enough to get Aang out, and then the characters all go on a journey where they all sort of develop and become, you know, the best versions of themselves, where like Sokka goes on to later pass the ice dodging test. Katara, you know, learns to kind of use her emotions in a better way and so on, and then Aang, obviously his Avatar journey. I just think that's a very interesting thing, especially the whole ice dodging thing here. I do like that you have that comparison here to Bato, just with regards to like, oh yeah, he succeeds at the thing he missed out on in the first episode. But it's a key moment. Boy in the Iceberg. There's rumors that we're going to be getting a Boy in the Iceberg Funko Pop. So it's a key scene that like it's mentioned like with Gran later on when she, I suppose, sees how things play out, that it's the destiny of these two that they found Aang. And this is like the importance of these three coming together, is that the world needs its avatar, but for Aang to be the avatar, he needs the support of his friends because he doesn't have anyone. So I do like that dynamic. But what are your thoughts on that sequence that leads to them finding Aang?
No, I like that. I think it works pretty well. I mean, the whole way that it harkens back to what happens later on is nice, and the fact that this is sort of, basically, they make it, they have it all set up basically as an accident. Like he's trying to get away, he's trying to dodge the rocks, and eventually that leads to him having conflict with Katara that, gets her using her powers. So I don't know. I like that that's sort of the precipice for how they want to start this series. I mean, there had to be some setup for, how this whole, world is set up and how this character is going to be around at this point in time for it to actually work. And I think for most people, for majority people, even as, unbelievable and scientifically maybe implausible that might actually be for this world and how they're setting things up, it works enough for what they're trying to go for here. And it's definitely not perfect per se, but I think it's entertaining and for the audience, and I think so far, for as long as it's been out so far, it's majority worked. And the fact that these are the three that we start with and that we end with, I think is a nice, I guess, through line for the whole series as you go on this sort of journey of these characters.
Yeah, definitely. I like as well what they sort of do with the kind of characters, in that they get across that like Katara is very responsible, but is like almost like too responsible, like for a 14-year-old, to the point where like, she is effectively, it seems like, one of the main people in charge of like chores around the village, and we obviously learn that like she's taken on a lot of responsibility after the death of their mother. She's kind of missing fun from her life, and so that's where like Aang comes in and kind of changes things from the village, which is like struggling to survive, and everything is like pretty intense, which maybe plays into the whole Sokka thing of like he's trying to turn them into like serious warriors at such a young age, instead of just letting them have fun. So that's a really fun thing, and just the penguin sliding scene obviously emphasizes that that's what he wanted when he first woke up. They eventually go to do it, and it's a fun bonding moment for Aang and Katara, but it leads them to the ship at the end, and it's obviously, this is where we get a major reference to an episode, which is Puppet Master, with the whole Hama situation. We do get to see Gran when she was younger. Looking back at that scene, she looks more like teenager during that scene, whereas I think Katara says Gran was a little girl when this happened. Maybe it's just that one shot of Kana in the Puppet Master just makes her look a little bit older than she's meant to be, but it's I get what they're going for here, ultimately. But still very cool that we actually go on to like effectively meet one of the characters who iced that ship there in the first place, and that Gran was around when the attack came from that ship, and she knows what happened to all the other waterbenders, and that's why Katara is so important in the South, that she is the last southern waterbender. So I like a lot of those connections as well, that this ship in that position, sort of angled upwards, there's a significance to it, more than just showing that here's evidence of the Fire Nation attacking the South. It's a specific thing that references a really key element later on. So what are your thoughts on that? They, again, a lot of book 1 to book 3 connections ultimately in here.
Yeah, no, I think that's really a nice way of connecting things, just showing how important something is, not just towards, the whole overall story and the Fire Nation attacking, but, towards the characters that we actually meet in the village, how they actually have, a direct connection with the events that actually have, been happening for the last, number of years here. And, it also works towards just introducing us towards, the Fire Nation Navy and their ships, which eventually we get to see a little bit more of when Zuko, directly comes, and you actually get to understand more of the sort of like, I guess, sort of imposing nature of the ships. So, that whole idea, I think, is really important. And they try to get across, how, Qatar is not supposed to be on this ship, how, they know that that's something that has like bad memories for the whole tribe and, for much of the world, I would gather, just because of all of, what the Fire Nation has been doing for the last 100 years. So I think that really, I don't know, I think it really emphasizes what's going on, and that really is sort of the first time where we get to see Aang really sort of understand the gravity of what has been happening, because up until that point he really doesn't quite get it, which, I mean, I guess you could even say that even after this point it kind of seems like he still kind of brushes it aside, which is of course part of his character development and growth overall. Is just sort of coming more to terms with things that have happened in the past, but at least it starts him on his sort of path of understanding what it really means to be the Avatar, which he himself says he doesn't quite get.
Yeah, like it is an interesting one in that, like, on the ship, yeah, it is the first time he sees something that is very clearly, oh, the Fire Nation did attack people. There is a war on. It's you can't deny it. But then at the end, when Katara sort of figures out that, like, oh, it's not just that you were like trapped in ice for a little bit, like, you must have been in there for a full 100 years for you to have no concept of the war whatsoever. And like you say, it doesn't fully hit him, like, what that means, in that he initially goes to just think about, like, oh, my room must be a mess, I'll just go back and clean it. Like, when he's sort of banished, he is thinking like, oh, I can just go to the air temples and like things will be normal. Like, he's not thinking that 100 years means everyone is gone by default, without even factoring in knowledge of the genocide, which Katara, like, I suppose, what are your thoughts on like how much Katara, or I suppose Gran as well, how much they know about like what actually happened to the airbenders? Because like Kana Gran is like, I suppose, old enough to like have maybe heard like tale of it to some degree, to know the extent that like it's not just that like it's rare to see an airbender, but that they are gone. What's your interpretation on like the water tribe at this point? Like, do they know what happened? Like, obviously Katara doesn't until later, but do you think Gran actually knows about the genocide? Or
That's a good point. I mean, I really want to think that she has a better understanding. I think, I don't know, I think it's more of it's sort of like an awkward situation to try to explain to someone who's, obviously very young in terms of like a word that they can really sort of understand and grasp. I mean, she does say, we haven't seen them in 100 years. Like, no one knows anything about the airbenders, but, that just saying that to someone that young and, via us, the audience and the age bracket isn't, it's a concept that I guess, understandably Aang doesn't quite get initially. The whole idea that there is no one else left, which, eventually, that comes pretty apparent in just the next couple of episodes. So it's not like it's something that they linger on too much. But I think, from the first two episodes, I think you don't quite, sort of understand the gravity of that sort of situation until later on, which for some people can work and for other people could not work, because it's like, he's just sort of like ignoring the obvious almost.
Yeah, and there's maybe a slight sense that when like Katara says 100 years, like he's just thinking like, oh, like 10, 20, like not quite 100. But so he feels like a lot of the people probably might still be around. But obviously that's where 103 is very important in it becoming really clear to Aang what the situation is. But yeah, there's that. I think that's basically everything from the like 101 that I want to talk about. Like in terms of like early kind of like maybe teething problems, like it's actually not as like I usually always like when I review these episodes kind of maybe think that like, oh, tonally it's not quite here, it has to take a few episodes to get there. But I think the only real thing I noticed that felt very sort of Nickelodeon-y was just the Appa sneezing on Sokka and sliming him. Everything else I felt was like, okay, like there's some humor here, but I think that's part of Avatar. Like the flying, flying sister joke is pretty good. That kind of immediately follows that. The writing is, I think, pretty good here. The only real kind of times I notice kind of maybe early teething problems is just like Iroh right towards the end of 102 feels like they maybe haven't quite got his character down, because one, it's like the only time in the entire series he attacks Team Avatar, and two, his dialogue to Zuko after that is like, it's funny that the greatest threat to the Fire Nation is just a kid, oh, the Fire Lord will be happy about this, or he says something about it that doesn't feel like he would say that even at all referencing Ozai, and that I don't think he's like that supportive of what Zuko wants to do, that he'd talk at all about Aang like that, given that he is Order of the White Lotus. Now, this maybe speaks to the idea that we surprisingly don't get too many scenes of, like, I suppose during the show, especially early on, like Iroh interacting with like Aang to get across how he views the Avatar, but it's just like a little bit off. They immediately, I think, correct it like in the next episode and so on. And like we never really see much hints of this again. He seems to, more or less in any time we see the gang, he's usually pretty friendly with them and open with them. He never really views them as enemies after this. So what are your thoughts on that? Did you notice any like early series like teething problems here in these episodes?
I mean, the whole idea of the sort of sneeze and sort of the more comedic bits, I think, those are the parts of the show that I think can either work or not work for you. And especially since this is, geared as a kid's show, that's, more the elements that, we are sort of like default have to be included for better or worse, just because of how it's produced and who is for. And I don't know, honestly, I can understand for some people if that kind of like puts them off from the show. I mean, I think for the most part it works for me. Like those are just like a couple random bits, or they have a couple times where they'll like insert some of the more sort of like comedic, sort of more cartoony, sound effects for, responses to things. Like there's one part with Gran where they insert like a deadpan sound effect and some things like that. So I think, those do stand out to you, and those could maybe make it seem a bit more, I guess, immature than you might think it might actually be. But I don't know. I don't think that those are, too broad as things, and they do come and go throughout the whole series. But I think, they're usually there to add some more sort of brevity to things. And the whole idea of, Iroh maybe being a bit more out of character than we might think, I don't know. That's a good point. I mean, he is a general, or he was a general, and he is part of the Fire Nation. And even though we view him as, more of like a balanced Fire Nation person compared to a lot of the other ones, I mean, I guess from your initial idea of trying to, even though at this time we don't necessarily know that Zuko's, going to turn out all right in the end, we're still sort of seeing the Fire Nation as sort of like more of the big bad, even though we don't quite understand from these first two episodes who the real big bad is. So I don't know. I wonder if they're just, more so trying to put it in our minds that Fire Nation is evil, that whole sort of like cut and dry thing, which of course we know that the whole point of the show and everything they go for is that everything isn't quite as, black and white as it may seem. So I don't know, it might just be sort of their initial trying to show that off to you as the viewer, as opposed to where they later on end up with Iroh. But that is interesting. I mean, Iroh, his character overall in this one, it really is, seems like he's, more, other than where he's trying to get Zuko to sort of train in a different sort of way, he's more, I don't know, just sort of direct with what he's sort of thinking is going to work out for the Fire Nation at this point in time, which changes, of course.
Yeah, like it definitely surprised me that like I wasn't like really that like annoyed at any of like the early humor or anything like that here. I think it is just that like the show every so often does a little bit of sort of like kind of potty humor, in that like the whole like, are there bathrooms in the spirit world, like I think comes up in like season 3 even. Like they make those jokes every so often, but they don't overdo it to where, it comes across like super like SpongeBob-y. A lot of the humor, I think, even in this early episode, is actually quite good. Like you said, the deadpan bit where just call me Gran, like, you don't need to you don't need to know my name type thing. She just lets everyone call her that. That was good. The you're just a child, you're just a teenager is actually like pretty clever. So a lot of that I think does work, and yeah, it's just stuff like, okay, yeah, Appa sneezes and like, Sokka gets Nickelodeon TM slimed, that sort of stands out a little bit, but nothing too bad. The next point I want to talk about is what I ended up kind of connecting with as maybe one of my favorite moments across both two episodes, is the scene at the start of 102 where Aang gets banished from the Southern Water Tribe, because it gets across, I think, a lot of the character dynamics here. That Aang's willing to go along with them. He doesn't want to like put them out or anything like that, so he'll accept whatever decision that they make. Sokka is obviously very skeptical of Aang still, and is trying to protect the village and his sister. But Katara, I like that we see her frustrated by how, in a way, stubborn and kind of irrational the village is being about Aang and what just happened. That she, like, through meeting Aang, like, her world is beginning to sort of expand, because they've talked about the idea that Aang has the ability to like bring her somewhere where she can train in her waterbending, and otherwise she is stuck just being that responsible one in the village doing the chores, like the scene earlier on in the episode where Gran was just like, oh, Katara, you're busy, you've got to do all this stuff. So you can see the frustration is like she's defending Aang in this scene, but it's also like she can see that through Aang, like she does have that destiny to kind of, be the person she needs to be, and especially given that like the story about like why she is the last waterbender, that her mother sacrificed her life to kind of allow Katara to be the waterbender, her fulfilling that potential and becoming a master. I like that idea that there's a kind of slight element of that in the background, even if Katara doesn't maybe know that that's maybe an element of it. So I think it's just a good scene, because Katara, you could have maybe seen a way where you could do this, where Katara just does go with Aang, but she ultimately decides to stay with her family, Water Tribe family stuff, of course, and Aang is okay with that. But, as things go on and they see Aang come back, be brave, show that, willingness to step up as the Avatar when he needs to, it begins to kind of come full circle. And kind of ultimately, kind of Katara's proven right to have such faith and hope in Aang. So what are your thoughts on this scene? Especially that idea that Katara was almost willing to go with Aang right then and there.
Yeah, no, that definitely would have been a different story if they sort of went on their way without Sokka in this sort of case here. But I think, it shows, I guess, sort of the initial sort of bonds of family that the Water Tribe has in general, just for their people, which I think is something that, is important to get across. And I think that's pretty clear in here, just sort of the family and the tribe sticking together here. But yeah, you do see the pull that Katara has in terms of, her world being expanded, her wanting to, become a bender and sort of understand what that really means to her. And we know from the future, of course, that has a strong connection with her mother. So that's something that's really important to her, even if, like you said, she doesn't quite understand why that's so important to her. But she can see that things are changing here, and of course the grandmother can see this as well. And Sokka, he's reluctant on this, but eventually we do see him coming around to this later on. But no, I think that is a really good way to sort of show sort of what Aang is willing to do in terms of people. And this is just him sort of being his core sort of character, and sort of caring about what's going on with the people that he's meeting. So it definitely shows some of the better qualities that he actually has as a person, which eventually leads into him being the Avatar.
Which, yeah, I probably should have mentioned this earlier on, but just the fact that Aang has actually traveled the world, like prior to the start of the series, I think is a very interesting point. That we haven't seen a lot of it. Like, we have the Dragon Days story where we get to see Kuzan. So like, he's been to the Fire Nation and he actually knows what it's like before it was, the warring kind of nation. I forget, like, do we know exactly how much of the world he has or has not seen? He gives a reason for why he's never been to Ba Sing Se, I think, doesn't he? Because it's meant to be his first time going there. But of course he's been to Omashu and other places. Did they ever say if he has been to either of the water tribes or?
That's a good point. I don't know. I don't think so.
He doesn't seem to know necessarily where he is, so I'm guessing water tribes he hasn't been to, but still, he's more traveled than the relatively isolated water tribe characters, and I do like that there are kind of like elements of that come out. And obviously in those stories we saw that like Kuzan and Aang work together to save some dragon eggs, so like Aang is willing to get involved in these type of situations and do a little bit of like Avatar adventuring, heroing when he needs to. It's just, I suppose, the responsibility of the role that is the bigger issue here for him. But going off the previous point there, that scene with Katara, I like that when Aang kind of gives himself up to save the village, that is the moment that like Katara decides, in a way, like, I don't care what anyone else says, I'm going after Aang to save him. That, no one agreed with me before, but I'm doing this now. And you have that kind of moment of like, she is talking over Sokka, but Sokka's actually at this point already decided to help Aang as well. And then they're almost expecting Gran to disagree with them, but then Gran is turned around as well, which, like we discussed in the previous episode, is the way the scene goes with Katara and Korra. Korra expects Katara to disagree with her leaving, but agrees because of this scene, I suppose, effectively. And I do like that Gran, I suppose, the second she realizes Aang is the Avatar, you can see that she does have that kind of sense of like, she believes in the idea of like destiny, that you found him, got him out, and have like connected with him in a way where you think he is going to change things. I can now see that too. So it makes me wish maybe we got to see a little bit more of Gran to maybe see where that all comes from. But as the older character, I don't mind the idea that she was kind of just going along with things, but even she has the Avatar is back type situation, because her opening narration, Katara, seems to very much emphasize that, I haven't lost hope, I believe the Avatar will return, when I don't think she ever like says that in the actual like body of the series. We never get the sense that like before she found Aang, she was always talking about the Avatar and hoping for the Avatar to return. Ultimately, they just get across the idea that she has hope that things will change, I guess. But it's a pretty cool dynamic. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that scene where sort of the group forms, they've decided they're going to be sort of leaving the tribe here at this point, and how that all takes place?
No, that's a great scene there. I mean, it really shows, sort of Katara's character at core is, as soon as something is really, unjust to her and doesn't go with what she thinks is the right thing, that she's willing to pretty much do whatever it takes in order to right the wrongs there. So no, I really like how, she's able to sort of come to that conclusion, and Sokka has pretty much come to the same conclusion, either because he can see that Aang is actually a good person, or just just to support his sister. I think is it's a good moment for them as the start of their actual journey here. And like, yeah, the comparison to Korra and the same, basically the same sort of situation here, just that Korra was on her own in that sort of situation, minus Naga, of course. Just sort of makes it come full circle here. And yeah, I don't know. I think there would have been something cool there if we could see more of a characterization of Gran in terms of like where her idea of the hope comes from. But I don't know. I don't think that's necessarily as needed. That whole sort of trope there. I think it works well regardless of if you have the full understanding of the background, of why she was able to sort of believe in destiny and let her grandkids go on this journey that who knows how it will actually turn out. But she has just as much hope as Katara has in this sort of instance here. So no, I think it works really well.
Yeah, like I definitely think that the series could have made like a deeper connection. Like I think if they've maybe found some way to like tell the Hama flashback from Gran's perspective, where like we actually get like young Gran. If you just kind of characterized her as being somewhat like Katara, because it would also still be an era where the Avatar is technically like missing. So if she just, and that would, I suppose when that takes place, like it would be like, I suppose, what, 20, 30 years maybe missing or something like that. But like a much more like reasonable span of time where like realistically the Avatar could return. Just even having some line of dialogue where like her reaction to what's happened to the tribe after the attack is, I have hope that the Avatar will return someday to like, help the tribe recover, end what's happening with the Fire Nation. And just young Kana saying something somewhat similar to Katara having hope in Aang. But I think you kind of get that. I think in the Puppet Master scene, Kana is sort of presented in a way where it looks like Katara looking on at certain scenes. So it's there, even if it's not focused on too much. Because destiny gets brought up. It's more, I suppose, in relation to Zuko by Iroh, but we also don't get too much of an explanation behind like why like Iroh is like super focused on destiny and the whole he had that dream and he thought that was his destiny and so on. So it's fine. Like just they're playing on the whole like elder wise character trope, which is fine.
Yeah.
So that's that. The last I think key character moment is I've always really liked the line of dialogue where like they have the serious scene as they're kind of fleeing, and it comes out like, why didn't you tell us you were the Avatar? And Aang's response is just because I never wanted to be.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't tell you the full story, but it gives you the idea of like, oh, like the Avatar, this really important role. Yeah, what if someone just happened to be the Avatar and actually never wanted all that responsibility? And that is a very interesting character arc by itself. It is the reluctant Avatar. It's the opposite of Korra, like we discussed last time. But obviously they don't go into this until episode 12, basically, and we find out that it's because him being found out to be the Avatar changed everything. But also, it sort of changed everything at exactly kind of the wrong time. That there's a reason why they often wait until the Avatar is 16 to tell them. Telling him early at 12, and with the other stuff that was going on with the sort of politics of the elders and Gyatso, it all just kind of led to Aang, this happening for Aang. Again, it's not told until the later episodes, but it's a line that I like, in that very serious, but then it's like we're together now. The plan, I guess, is for you to learn the elements, Aang. We can learn water together. There's your plot for the entire season, basically. And then Aang gets into, we can go here, 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 and here, which again is basically the plot of the season. It's like, we'll have fun trips along the way until the plot finally kicks in, which that's book one, effectively. So what are your thoughts on the kind of ending here, and the setup for Aang's arc here, of kind of explaining, like, okay, missing for 100 years, even now, never wanted to be the Avatar. What are your thoughts?
It's like what really makes you the Avatar? Like, what is the defining characteristics? Like, we've mentioned earlier that we've seen some of the qualities that one might actually have. The willingness to put yourself forth in certain situations, and to combat things, and to be able to mediate things, and working with people. So we can see some of those qualities here, but Aang doesn't really understand that, which, understandably, at the age that he currently is, not wanting to be the Avatar, is something that he really has to develop here, which I think is a good point for Katara to sort of realize this as well, because she sort of seems to have this sort of like unwavering faith in the Avatar, and what that person means to the world and how they can change things. But she's coming to realize that this person who is all of that doesn't quite understand what all of that actually means, and doesn't even have all of the bending prowess in order to combat those things. So I think it's a good setup for that whole sort of journey here. And I think if you can understand that leads a lot to be played out in the whole rest of the season and the other books later on.
Yeah, and there's that slight element that, like, sort of Aang is like fun, not wanting the responsibility, and then Katara is like responsibility but doesn't have the fun. It's not really the dynamic that they go for between Katara and Aang, but it's just, kind of the fun aspect is sort of like that they need to defeat the Fire Nation so that the kids can have a life that is more filled with fun, rather than kind of some sense of a requirement for them to be taught almost military tactics at such a young age, that you sort of laugh at that scene of Sokka training them, but there's also a sense where, like, well, if he doesn't do this, like, there won't be organization in the village. They have to do something. And then obviously Aang and his sort of responsibility, it's not like Katara who like teaches Aang to have that responsibility, is more of like his own arc, but it's still just a nice kind of contrast that they do have those kind of elements there, and that Aang is what kind of helps Katara to achieve her goal, and then it's only with the help of his friends, especially Katara, who's, I suppose, the one who supports Aang the most, that Aang is able to be the Avatar that he needs to be. So that's quite good. Is there any other parts of these opening two episodes you want to talk about?
Not in specifics. I think the only other thing that I was thinking of, if I could even think of it, would be sort of anything that you might have noticed on your rewatch here that you might not have thought of seeing on sort of like your earlier watch throughs or sort of early viewings, if you can remember that far back for the episodes. Like the one that was, I don't know, sort of stood out to me, which I'm sure I've noticed it, but it was just sort of the tiles that Ira was using earlier on that weren't Pai Sho or anything like that, but they just had the different elements on them, and his sort of laying out for those, and sort of the subtle ways that they're sort of indicating, sort of the Aang is the airbending and that is the Avatar that's coming through, or anything along those lines that might have stood out to you this time that were maybe a bit more subtle.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, what on this watch through actually stood out the most? Well, it like it's just a kind of a more funny one. It just like at the very end of the episode one, just like Zuko kind of watching through the kind of like telescope eyeglass thing. It's just like, okay, Zuko, you probably need to get your eyes checked there, because like Aang's not like super small the way you're seeing him, but you're just like, oh, you're agile for old age, even though like, you know, Aang's like smaller than Katara in like these scenes and stuff like that. So that's always been like a bit of a kind of fun scene, but that's quite good. What actually did stand out to me is that I'd always, when like thinking about this, always felt that the Avatar state scene for Aang here was kind of like relatively weak. But actually watching it again, like it's a really tall water spout where he like comes really far out of the water. It's probably one of the highest ones that we've seen, and because it's just quick and brief, it maybe doesn't stand out as being really powerful, but it actually does do a really good job at getting across that, yeah, this is the most powerful bending attack that we've seen so far. That like what Aang did there was like vastly more powerful than even like the Iroh Zuko combined attack. That was good, because I would always sort of like kind of dismiss this one as just like, oh yeah, Aang does sort of like relatively normal level water bending to sort of knock Zuko out, but no, it's a super impressive display, to the point where like Zuko is like stunned still looking up at it, because he's probably never seen anything like this before. So that kind of surprised me, and that like just I'd always considered, that one's not great, but I don't know. What are your thoughts on the Avatar state scene actually?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I didn't even think of that, because it is really impressive. I think it's kind of like misleading, because once he comes down on the ship and just sort of pushes all of them, the soldiers away, that seems like it could almost be a bit tame. Like, a master level waterbender might be able to do that if they already had like the water in place. But the fact that he's able to gather all of that water up and out from the sea, and the whole sort of column water up, that part I think is actually pretty strong. Because I mean, we've seen a few instances of that, and I can think of more from Korra than I can from Avatar in terms of that specific technique. And usually they're not that high, or if they do get that high, they pretty much like fall apart once they get that high. So that does sort of show the strength of that ability. And this is sort of like the self-defense part of it, so it's different than if you were trying to control yourself. So there is something to be considered there. And I think that does get sometimes that does get mentioned in terms of like Avatar state, strong sort of like abilities, but it is more often sort of overlooked because it is so early, in the whole series.
Yeah, and just I think Avatar state stuff in general, it can be weird the way people view it, because it's almost like, oh, if an Avatar further down the line uses the Avatar state and they don't do the giant like spheres of all elements, that it's like weaker than anything. When it's like, no, your description of this scene is actually quite good. Like the water spout coming out of the water is a like display of pure power. Like it's movement, but he goes higher than he needs to go. But then when he actually gets down on the ship, the Avatar state only does what is needed to win the fight. It could have like done giant tidal wave and just like eliminated it, but that would have been like overkill times like a million. But just a really skillful, like strong kind of like band of water, just taking out everyone in a kind of quick, skillful move rather than like pure power, I think is kind of what the Avatar state is. It is pure power, but it is also the mastery of all the past avatars as well. So skill and like subtlety has to come into it also, which is present there in a lot of the powerful scenes with regards to like earth compression and keeping the elements like spinning like that. But in these more subtle moments, and especially like the way Korra often uses the Avatar state is in moments like this, where it's a, like you sort of said, like it's a master level move that like a normal bender could do, just slightly more powerful. Whereas like, when you're in control of the Avatar state, you don't need to hover in the air making yourself a giant target at all times. You can just like boost your normal attacks, and arguably be slightly more effective. Otherwise, you run the risk of maybe what happens with, say, Korra versus Ahir, where if you just charge in full power, you can just get kind of counterattacked quite easily. So it's always one of those weird things where, like, they never overly consider power levels when they, like, make the scenes necessarily. And I think overall it actually works relatively consistently, but it's just an interesting one to consider, definitely. Other than that, no, kind of like I said on the Korra reviews, I just find Korra often is just a slightly more interesting show to discuss than Avatar, because I think there's maybe more sort of like disagreements to be had, whereas, we could have almost any member of the fandom on with us discussing this, and we probably all agree on everything about Avatar, but we actually might disagree a lot on, like, Korra stuff, and that just kind of makes it slightly more interesting, and that kind of feels like we're just going through, like, maybe the same points here with ATLA, because it's so respected, it's so well regarded as being one of the best animated shows of all time. There's not too much to say that's, like, profound and interesting that kind of hasn't been said before, but it is very, very good. Even though, like I said at the start, these are not two of, like, I think the best episodes in the show. Again, on my list I have 101 as my 49th favorite episode and 102 as my 39th favorite episode. And it seems crazy, but like I always say when I do videos on those lists, when you actually put your list together yourself, you'll realize that it's actually really easy to make, say, like, your top 20 and your bottom 10, but, like, the episodes that you place, like, 35 to 45 are, like, the trickiest ones. And you end up having episodes you really, really like in these positions that don't feel like they should be there. But then you have to keep in mind that, like, okay, 102 is a good episode, but, like, all the episodes of basically all the finales, I think, are better than 102. A lot of the middle of book 2 episodes are quite good. Book 1 has other episodes that are better. And straight away, you're getting close to, like, at least 15, 20 episodes already. And then it's more of a comparison with episodes that are in or around the same as it. And that's just what happens. But yeah, I don't think I have any other points. Like, I do like that they sort of established straight away that, like, Sokka's boomerang has a kind of lucky element to it, that he can do nothing against Zuko, but it coming back gives him the first hit against Zuko. That's quite good. Beyond that, I don't think I have anything else. Yeah, they just that I guess Katara, at the very least, I mentioned that she doesn't mention the her, talking about, hoping the Avatar returns. She does know the Avatar cycle, though, because she lists in the right order the elements that Aang should learn. So that's maybe at least something to show that she maybe thinks about it to a certain degree. But do you have any final thoughts about these first 2 episodes here?
No, I don't think that's. I think that's it for me.
So next time out on the podcast, we're obviously going to be doing a review of the Free Comic Book Day book, which, as we discussed, is going to be us reviewing some preview pages as well as one new short story, the Korra one. So we will actually do Avatar and Korra episode reviews on that podcast, because I think we're going to get through that free comic quite quickly. So we're going to be reviewing on the next podcast episode Avatar 103, so Southern Air Temple, and then Korra K103, the Revelation. So really interesting episodes because they're both really, really good. One thing I'll always say with Avatar is that if I'm recommending someone to check it out, I always go for the first 3 episodes, not the first 2. Because I think 103 is, like, it's the episode where, like, the extra layer of, like, nuance in the series gets added on by showing you that Zuko's not just the villain, that there's actually, like, there's a disconnect between him and the Fire Nation and stuff like that. And then, yeah, our first, like, I suppose, proper look at Amon on the Korra side of things as well. So the 103s are both fantastic in my mind, but just your very initial thoughts there on the grouping of episodes we have for next time out.
Yeah, no, I think those are really good. I think the idea of getting to the first 3 episodes, like you said, is really, really key, which I think could be hit or miss for some people because a lot of people expect things to start off really fast. So I think that's a good recommendation there.
And yeah, so those two for next time out, and the free comic, of course. But yeah, other than that, that has been episode 241 of the Avatar Online podcast. It's been myself and Greg. Thanks for listening, and bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay.